if we can set up education not as this, you go to university for 4 years, you learn everything you need to learn, and then you go out to your career. And instead, think of it more as you learn the foundations, how to be a learner, how to be curious, how to take agency over your career life, etc. And think of college more as those 4 years you're learning those skills, and then you go out and be a continuous learner, someone who's enthusiastic about creating and building. And I mean, that's my big picture goal for education as a whole.
We should be recording now. This is Mark Manning. Once again, I'm in Chadds Ford. It's March 18th, 2026. Dave has returned to his home in Switzerland, and he's joining me via video. So, good morning, Dave.
Hey, good morning, Mark.
We talked last time a little bit about your business, and today we want to dig in a little deeper on, kind of why you started the business, I guess ultimately what you want the business to be, what your journey has been. There's a lot of talk about AI taking over the world and that's a broad meaning. That could mean that, AI is going to do everything for us while we all lay on the beach and live happily ever after. Another side of that spectrum is we're already at the point of no return on building AI models, and we run a very deep threat that they will kill us, that AI will take over the world. And we can walk over to another section of that spectrum where maybe these are more where the naysayers are, that, look, AI it's an aid. It's not a human. We're a long way away from making higher levels of intelligence for the foreseeable future and for probably the most people that are alive today on this planet. It'll still be a human-dominated world where we are in the pilot seat and AI perhaps is, the flight attendants. So that's kind of how I see that spectrum. David, any thoughts before I go beyond there?
So, yeah, when you think big picture like this, I do ultimately believe that the world is going to be weirdly different in 5 years from the perspective of what AI has done to change a lot of, careers, society, education, all of these things. I think everything is going to be touched by it. I think you can think of the internet as sort of the best proxy that I think we have, as look how much has changed from 20 years ago or 30 years ago. I think we're going to see that same change maybe in 4 or 5 years at most. And I think that's probably the best framework I have to understanding where this might go, how weirdly different it's going to be. I mean, if you take a farmer from, say, the 1800s and you stick them in an office building with 100 people looking at a computer screen doing Excel sheets, they would be like, what the heck is going on? And I think it's possible that in 5 years from now, we're going to be like that farmer in a skyscraper on a floor of 100 traders looking at screens and being like, what the heck is going on? So I think maybe 5 years, maybe 10 years, but I think that's the kind of change that might be coming. It's hard to say definitively, but I have to say, from my experience using AI today, every day, talking to friends who coded, every day, they were coders and they haven't written a line of code in 6 months. And even looking at what it could do 2 years ago, a year ago, and what it can do today, it's so much better. And I think I haven't seen anything that's super convincing that it's going to slow down. I mean, so for me, high level, I'm optimistic. I think the idea of AI going rogue on its own and destroying the world because it wants to create paper clips, I think that's a lot less likely than these powerful tools being used by people in charge who may have either personal interests or nefarious interests, or let's be honest, just wanting to make a lot of money at the expense of a lot of people. And I think the best thing you can do today is learn how to use these tools, take advantage of them to build, create, solve problems. And, I think if we can do that, then we set ourselves up for a success.
What I'm hearing is, extrapolating past, historical acceleration advances in technology, but not increasing it linearly. Of course, this is be an exponential growth. And, rough math, maybe that exponential growth over the next 5 years is all the growth that happened in the previous 30 years or something, something like that, where it's hard to fathom just how fast this goes once that slope really starts to take hold, right? So you're fair enough, you're extrapolating what has happened, the acceleration of that, and then extrapolating out that continued acceleration. Okay, we are going to bring it back to the here and now. And I think a good rationale for doing that is it it always strikes me that we have grand predictions for what's going to happen 10 and 20 years from now, but we have a hard time even predicting the next quarter's growth rate or unemployment or inflation numbers that we've been trying to do for, decades, if not centuries, and we're not very good at even that. So I'm gonna say to you that I think that 5 years from now, families will still be created, maybe not as many families, maybe not as many babies are born, but generally there'll be traditional households still here in the United States and probably where you live there in Switzerland, call it Europe, Western Europe, that the way humans conduct themselves is not going to change much in the next 5 years. Okay. So we still have parents, and parents will still have legal control over a minor. The parents that the children that are born into parents that are fortunate enough where the parents are able to focus on Johnny and Susie's success, the parents are very good at that, right? They really care about where Johnny and Susie, who they interact with, what their moral values are, how well they can read, maybe throw a ball, maybe play checkers. But and they will care very much about the education. And so I don't think that will change too much in the next 5 years. Do you agree? Or please add anything that you think from that spot.
No, I think foundations of education are going to be still important. And I think, yes, parents play a huge role, especially early on in that development. And also, yes, the resources of a parent or family play a big role in that trajectory setting of that education. I think maybe one caveat I'd want to add that I think about a lot now is how does education relate to careers? I think that paradigm is really rapidly changing, but I still strongly believe that a foundation in education, in reading, in math, in social interactions, sports, to me is so important, the most important. But I also think we need to think deeply about what are the skills that are going to lead to a successful career. Because I think looking backwards, there's a lot of overlap between what I just said and career success. But I think if we're looking in this post AI future world, I think there's a lot of like less tangible skills that are more important than, say, IQ to determine career success.
What that education is, we're not sure. Nobody's sure. But Parents are anxious about it, right? I mean, I can tell you today when I speak to clients and families, especially with families that have younger children that are still in that K to 12 segment that you're targeting, they're very some of them are very anxious about this. Let's talk about what the traditional path is before we come back to your path, just to kind of I just want to kind of set the guidelines of our thinking here. When I was born and my parents wanted to get my gray matter filled up, they sent me to the local kindergarten and elementary school in Delaware, Newark, Delaware. And I don't think there was a lot of thought about, where else I was going to go. I don't think homeschooling was a big thing. There were no home computers to do any of this. You had to go to school. And so it was kind of like, that's it, right? Not allowed to think about. But, mom and dad cared about what reading group I was in second grade. And, was there art too? And was I able to go out in the playground? Is there a bus? And we're going to a public school that is funded by our state, by our country, by our government, by us, by our taxes. And that is part of the structure of the United States, that there is a funding for public education. Education was a right. And let's just jump to 5 years from now. Can you? I'd like to hear your opinion of do you think much of that we're describing right here will have changed much in 5 years?
I think government and things related to government move so slowly that it's hard for me to envision a future where we disrupt public education in such a way where schools are transforming radically and education happens at home or things like that. I think there's sort of pilot schools doing these AI teaching and things like that. And I could see in 5 years that takes more of a hold, but I really don't think that's going to be the norm. I think maybe we see more of these hyper innovative schools, but I don't think that that's going to replace the public education system. I don't think that's going to replace traditional teaching and learning. No, not in 5 years.
Okay, so and this is where I want to kind of make more of an, an assertion or opinion about what you're doing. So we've described where in 5 years from now, AI could be extremely disruptive. Everybody's smart. You know, Johnny and Susie's parents are at least as smart as you and I. The schools that are here in Delaware and in Switzerland, the principals, the school board, the teachers also see this. So I guess the question that I have for you is, which one do you think is going to be more nimble and receptive to a disruptive idea? Johnny and Susie's parents or the school board at the local public school?
Okay. Well, the quick answer is I think the parents would move first.
It's my guess too. So Johnny and Susie's parents know that there's a disruption coming. They see it at their jobs. Maybe they're even anxious about their own jobs with technology. We just kind of call it technology. And then they extrapolate that over the next 30 years when Johnny and Susie are going to be their age. And they're worried. That's kind of at the crust of what your business is trying to help with. If you really think about it, like that to me is the tension, the demand for a solution. So Johnny and Susie are now 18. Let's talk about what parents want for their 18 young adults. They've spent 18 years preparing them, molding them for something, for some mission, for some goal, for some accomplishment. What is that?
The first place my mind went is I don't know if it's my mom or my dad have they've got a million sayings, but one thing that I've heard them say before is you raise your kids to leave you. And I think at a high level that's actually pretty spot on. You want to raise kids who are able to leave you, who are able to find a path independent, not be reliant financially, emotionally, be present in their lives, but not dependent. And I think that's the first place my mind goes is you want them to be independent, your kids by 18. And no, maybe it's not 18, maybe it's 21, but yeah, I think just developing the skills, the mentality to take ownership of your career, of your life, and pursue, understand yourself and understand what you're good at, what your passions are, and be able to create your path, those kind of ideas. And yeah, I think that is what parents want education to provide in a lot of senses. And we need to make sure we're still doing that. And I think AI disrupts a lot of the well established paths that were pretty reliable, education wise, where high school, college, entry level, white collar job, that path works for a lot of people. And we need to be careful that we don't fall into the trap that assuming that path is going to be there forever.
I think that's a good starting place for a description of what the goals are. I'm going to guess that over the last 40 years, or maybe just the turn of the century, say 25 years, more than half, more than 50% go on to higher education. Let's call it college. One of a measurement of Johnny and Susie's success, that mom and dad have done a good job, is that Johnny and Susie are going off to college. What are your thoughts there? Like that's just I'm characterizing today.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I think that's the path, right? Graduate high school, go to college, 4-year undergrad, and then you get a job. And that's sort of the promise. And with we can get more into it, but I still, I think the conversation's coming where maybe this promise is breaking down a bit, and I think there's a lot of layers to why that is. I think AI is a huge part of it. I also think rising student debt and just, that sort of compounds this problem where you're coming out of college in debt and these jobs that are promised to you maybe are not as bountiful as you were promised. Then there's this real breakdown in trust with this path. But I'm feels like we're recognizing that it's breaking down a bit, but we still haven't really proposed or really there hasn't been a cultural sort of uptaking of an alternative path. So today I would say that's still the path.
And okay, and so we're getting to a critical part of some of the thoughts that I had prior to this conversation, which is what does that path look like 5 years from now? Okay.
Historically, the promise is these student loans are a good investment because your education is going to pay for this investment in the long run because you'll be able to get a better job and pay off these loans. Colleges are just charging so much more and they're not delivering on those promises. If you don't know what you want to do at 18, maybe community college where you spend, $5,000 a year instead of $50,000. You can go to vocational schools and do 2 years and learn to become an electrician and then do an internship or an apprenticeship. So I think that's one path. Entrepreneurship is a great path in these uncertain times. entrepreneurship is a lot more broad than that 1 million, that $100 million seed investment and that whatever exponential growth. There's a lot more paths to entrepreneurship that are more subtle. And one other one I just want to highlight, I think sales. I think I think we're going to see a lot more paths where coming out of university, people will go into sales for the first 2 to 5 years of their career and learn the business that way. Because I think what we're seeing in big corporations is entry level jobs, analyst roles, business development. Those first 2 to 5 years, they're not really adding value beyond what AI can do. But I think sales roles in these big corporations, if you're a young go getter willing to have conversations with clients and teach a skill and things like that, I think that's going to be a really good path for people coming out of university.
Well, you hit on a couple things that I think are really important in terms of describing change in higher education from, you know, call it my parents' generation to yours, is the subsidization of higher education by our federal government here in the United States for largely social policy, right? To help steer our economy into more service-based economy where just kind of at a primitive level, you touched on an 18-year-old with and the parent, you know, not sure what that 18-year-old can do in our society. And that is such a big change as we broaden out our lens beyond 5 years and look over generations. 100 years ago, you're 18 years old, you got something to do. You're helping with some physical labor aspects of our industry, farming, whatever the case may be. You've got a role to play at 18. You're a helper. And today, as you were describing with that 18-year-old and his parent, his father, since we're largely a service-based economy, there really isn't much of a role for an 18-year-old to do something in a service-based, cerebral type of economy. And so there was a social government, policy to subsidize higher education for the good of making that conversion. So what I'm getting at, again, let's go back to Dave Hobbs, is, and this is, I think, an important question for you and your business, is what does higher education look like over certainly the next 5 years? Because they're kind of like in the end zone of where you're trying to move the football, right? I mean, you're trying to get these kids to succeed, and we've agreed that a big measurement of success of an 18-year-old is to go to higher education. That is the way it's been. So another thing I think about with higher education, another analogy I think about is I've heard now for 40 years the prediction of the coming undoing of higher education, of formal higher education. It's going to fall apart. They charge too much. They're a ripoff. They don't educate kids. They just institutionalize them. They're not ready for work. They don't care. They're not in school very long. It's a sham. All these things, and it's going to get ruined. But Dave, if I really believed that, and I was raising Johnny and Susie, and my goal was to make Johnny and Susie as smart as possible, okay? If that was purely my goal for Johnny and Susie, Dave, 20 years ago, I could have put Johnny and Susie in free courses at Stanford, Yale, all the best schools have free courseware where you can educate yourself silly. So, why has that not destroyed or largely taken a huge chunk out of higher education? So, there must be something more to it than simply education. And I'm going to cut to what I think it is.
Hmm.
Okay. A degree, especially from a higher from a more reputable, higher status elite school in the United States, is a signaling into culture, our culture and our community, which we touched on here today about like, do we think that's going to change? And we've kind of characterized that as like frictional barriers to change. Do you think that that signaling, if I'm right about the signaling aspect of higher education, if it hasn't changed over the last 20 years with the ability to get basically free education, do you really think it's going to change with AI over the next 5?
It's a great question. and I want to make it clear, I'm not here to say nobody should go to college. I think it is a good path. And my main point, I think, is just to take a more critical gaze at it. What are you signing up for? What is the degree you're getting? And is it truly putting you towards your goals? So I think that's my main message. To your point, yes, I think college clearly still is valuable. A diploma is still valuable in signaling to the world that you are someone who has gone through this education process. You were able to, well, first off, graduate high school, get into a college, attend 4 years of college. And I think you're able to signal to whomever you've done that and you're capable of at least that. And I think there's a huge other part of this is where, the learning that happens at college outside of the classroom is super valuable. That that leaving home for the first time, building new friendships, being in a new place, learning how to manage yourself, I think that is valuable. And so, but just to sort of sum it all up in my thinking, and I really do need to reiterate, like I'm not here to say AI and college are completely incompatible. I think my real thinking is we can use college to kind of rework the education system, not to completely disrupt it or blow it up and get rid of college and everyone should be entrepreneurs out of high school, but more just understand that success in business these days is really more leaning towards these ideas of agency and how how can you organize a group of people, or how can you tackle problems in unique ways, how good you are at systems thinking and being an enthusiastic force and showing up every day. And I really like what you said, how these resources existed 20 years ago. You can learn anything you want, and these resources still exist. And if we can set up education not as this, you go to university for 4 years, you learn everything you need to learn, and then you go out to your career, and instead think of it more as you learn the foundations, how to be a learner, how to be curious, how to take agency over your career life, etc. And think of college more as those 4 years you were learning those skills, and then you go out and be a continuous learner, someone who's enthusiastic about creating and building. And I mean, that's my big picture goal for education as a whole. So yeah, let's do that.
Yeah. Yeah. How to be a functioning human being within our society.
Mm-hmm.
right? Which is, I guess, synonymous with preparing to leave your parents.
Mm-hmm. And society
Before
is changing.
and
So
society is
we need
changing.
to,
Okay, yeah,
education should
yeah,
also think
yeah.
about that.
So let me bring all this together, Dave. I kind of wanted to just kind of go through like what I was kind of doing, which is kind of like a logic train in my head, trying to match up what is the highest and best use skills? What does Dave Hobbs bring to the table? Since I'm an entrepreneur, I'm always thinking, what problem am I trying to solve? Why would somebody even pay me? What am I trying to do here? What am I helping? Who am I helping? I see a young man start a business and go and take his knowledge and experience in AI and try to help the institutions of education learn about this. But as I think through deeper, really the end customer is not, it's not the educational institutions, it's not the schools. It's the parents who control the customer of the school. And then I also see these frictional forces that we discussed as AI permeates through society. We didn't get into this too much, but I'm making the assumption that the frictional barriers inside of public education institutions that are funded by the federal government and state governments are huge. And the boards, having done some work, and so kind of in my business, Dave, you can go try to be an advisor to organization institutions. We call them institutions. You could go work, like pension funds or insurance funds or schools that have endowments. So I found it much more appealing to work with individuals. It's one decision maker. The reasons for getting fired, usually you could point your finger towards. You could have a conversation about it. You might not like it. But so I kind of overlay that to your business. I'm like, well, geez, really the ultimate customer are the parents of children if you're dealing in the K to 12. Dave Hobbs and what he brings to the table, not only are the parents more nimble and can make the decisions faster than the schools, but Dave Hobbs and what Dave Hobbs signals to everybody is much more attractive to Johnny and Susie's parents than the school board. He studies electrical engineering, then he goes to work at a big finance company, and then he goes to Europe, and then he gets his MBA. Wow. Those are the kind of things that we're trying to get Johnny and Susie to do. And now Dave is coming to us and saying, look, and so Johnny and Susie's parents are also worried about the AI thing that you're talking about, the disruption. And this kid that is obviously signaling to us that he has navigated successfully through his generations of challenges is now able to come to us and say, look, I recognize these challenges and I have a solution for you. You got some buyers there, Dave.
It, it's interesting. It's not the first time this idea has come up, right? Thinking about parents versus schools. And I think my thinking in the past, and maybe this is changing and maybe this conversation changes that thinking, but my thinking in the past was it was always easier B2B than it is B2C. And maybe that's a myth and maybe I was led astray, but I would need to rethink a bit about what I offer, right? Because I think, the crux of Voyager right now is helping teachers navigate this, helping teachers understand what the role of education should be
Well,
and
what
how
what
they.
power do they bring to the table for change agents?
Hmm. So I think I would argue that they would have more power than an individual in a macro scale. let's
Yeah.
say let's say money is not the thing and it's just about impact. I think, if I can get to 100 parents, that would be great. And I think, that would help 100 kids maybe. But if I can help 100 schools, I think systematically you're making a bigger impact. But then let's talk about, if we're thinking about more financially, business wise, I 100% agree that schools are not nimble. So, what would be the offer to say, a parent with a kid 15 years old? Am I teaching the parent how to teach? Am I teaching the kids? Am I tutoring? I think it's a completely different model because I think when I think about education as a whole, I can talk a lot about what is education now and how can we improve it, and what are teachers' problems and how can we solve those problems. But when you think about a parent, what role does a parent play in their kids' education besides picking the school?
Everything. So let's go to Tower Hill. Just to kind of put it bluntly, there is if a parent comes in,
Mhm.
they're calling the shots. Okay, they're the clients, they're the customers, and the nimbleness that parents, I mean, they'll talk to you at 8 in the morning, and at 10 the next, they're emailing me going, "Let's go.
Yeah.
I've had enough." They'll get one more phone call or one more. They can't get the kid off the phone one more time or whatever. They're going to take action,
Mm-hmm.
and so this is the part that you know to me takes a lot of work is you got to build all the reasons why we touched on higher education, all those things, but see, you bring credibility right away, and that is going to matter to them,
Mm-hmm.
and what that looks like and what you're building for them, I don't know.
I think coaching parents on technology with respect to kids and education could be it. Because I don't know if I'm making like a product, like an ed tech product you sell to parents that tutors them. I don't know if I'm tutoring kids, but I do think I could be good at coaching parents on maybe trajectory setting, thinking about college and thinking about AI. And I mean, another thing I like
Yes.
doing is just showing people that don't really get AI just what it can do. I mean, I do that with my dad,
Yes.
and I,
Yes. You are good at that. And I thought about that too prior to this recording. Was one of the things I wanted to bring up, but then I just went off on this tangent. Is you definitely, I think you really need to show people,
yeah,
and I think you're good at that. I think you need to show them, like you need to stun them with some incredible stuff that you're going to blow the mind of a 45-year-old. I
yeah,
mean, they're going to be like, "Oh my god." you know, and by the way, I love the thing that you said about sales with young professionals. I think that's wonderful. I think that's fantastic for a 23-year-old to just start
mm,
on sales and hit the
yeah,
pavement. Maybe with a senior person or something. But that's a great idea. But you know, ju- what's so the sales part of this for Dave Hobbs? The sales part is there's deep, deep anxiety about AI as it relates to raising children and
hmm,
bringing them and allowing them to live away from their parents, however your parents framed that. There's deep anxiety there. That's what you're going to try to solve. That's your business.
yeah.
That's the opportunity. And then using AI and leveraging, as you're saying, that you can be a one-man band and do this and have this whole thing. I mean, that's what's really cool about AI is you are getting entrepreneurs
Yeah, just do
that
it.
could just be like one or two people and they build stuff. I mean, and so that is a huge opportunity for you to kind of marry all those concepts together.
All right, lots to unpack. I'll watch the video and I'll put it
So
through
I
AI
thought it
a
would
few
be worth
times.
just
And
kind of recording this
yeah, it's
discussion.
awesome. No, it's really good. And honestly, I think yeah, it's good to. I appreciate just sort of the thinking about it because I think it's true, and I think it's sort of in this position where yeah, I think it's sort of ready for a pivot, or not even a pivot, just a
That's
whatever progression.
progression. Yeah, progression is what it is. It would be a progression.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I have to think
So,
about what the next steps would be. But this is awesome. Yeah, thank you for putting that
yeah,
all together and
good.
getting me there through the long winding story of
Yeah. And
education and
so,
the
yeah,
university.
yeah. And as you start to kind of put this all together, I do want to, um, you know, at some point you have to do some marketing, right?
Hmm.
And that's the part that I want to get your help with Tyler is like, how does that happen? Because that's ubiquitous. Marketing is kind of marketing, right? I mean, no matter what you're selling,
Definitely.
right? But there's a place for that. And you're both
Yeah.
kind of at the same stage there. So,
Yeah.
be
Yeah.
very interested to hear your thoughts and get help on that and
Yeah.
do
It's
that
definitely
later.
not my
So,
area of expertise, but it just comes down to putting yourself out there,
yeah.
like these
But in the end,
podcasts.
I mean, that is what an entrepreneur is, though. An
Yeah.
entrepreneur does that is you can't be afraid to, that's what you got to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, okay, so let me know what you want to do next,
Yeah.
and why don't you stew on that, and we can talk. Yep, yep.
All right. Sounds
Okay,
good. All right. Take it easy.
talk to you soon,
Thanks.
Dave. Okay,
Bye.
bye.